Living a criminal life can be quite tedious, but certainly not when you're a bona fide member of the Mafia. For these devious men of the mythical underworld, criminality is seen as a way of life and one of the critical factors that shape their identity. Join us on this intriguing journey as we walk you through a typical day in the life of a Mafia member. The Mafia. At the mere mention of the word Mafia, most people remember notorious mobsters and kingpins like Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, and Alphonse Gabriel Capone. But in reality, the origin of the word and the institution it represents are far beyond the achievements and reputation of these men. To accurately tell the tale of the Mafia, we've to travel all the way back to the 19th century when Sicily was under the rule of feudalism. At the time, many peasants and farmers occupied lands owned by monarchs and other noble elites who lived in Naples and Palermo. In a bid to maintain control over their lands, these imperial landlords leased them to middle-class citizens known as gabolotti under a written charter agreement. Over the next couple of years, the political influence and social power of the gabolotti would grow exponentially, and they'd eventually evolve to become the Mafia. As part of a written charter agreement signed by both parties, the Mafias agreed to pay an annual fee to the landowners. Furthermore, the Mafias signed labor contracts with the peasants. These contracts entitled the laborers to a fraction of the food they produced and granted them minimal access to the land for activities such as hunting and herding. This agreement lasted for a while, but things took a different twist during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. The Bourbon family had successfully taken over Sicily and decided to abolish Sicilian feudalism to pave way for the creation of the Italian state. In 1812, they announced a new wave of reforms, abolishing ancient traditions like the primogeniture, which allowed only the firstborn sons to inherit the properties of their father. They also enacted laws to give peasants property rights and abolish the tradition of seizing lands in debt settlement disputes. In the early days of their rule, these reforms yielded good results. For example, between 1812 and 1860, the number of landowners in Sicily rose by 900% from 2,000 to a staggering 20,000. However, the long-term benefits were far from encouraging. Most lands apportioned to the Oya peasants were small and of poor quality, and despite the efforts of the Bourbon kings to promote equality and freedom, a vast majority of the peasants were still excluded from the land ownership scheme. To make things worse, the new reforms saw most peasants lose the basic rights they enjoyed under the feudalism system, and leveraging on the chaos, the Mafia and the ruling class connived to suppress the poor even more. On top of that, the skewed societal structures and the absence of a proper policing system created a de facto system characterized by crime and lawlessness. So the Mafia, in its wisdom, stepped in as law enforcers to police the public through a controversial moral code called omerta, and in a twinkle of an eye, the Mafia became so powerful that they turned on the landowners. Instead of paying an annual fee as agreed under the written charter pact, the Mafia began to extort money from the elites to protect the crops on their land. As if this wasn't shocking enough, the Mafia also outlived the successive foreign governments that ruled over Sicily. By the early 1900s, several independent Mafia families had started to join forces to form a loose federation. Essentially, an average Mafia family consisted of several members ranging from fewer than 10 to more than 100 people, all arranged according to a hierarchical structure that outlines the position of each member. At the top of this structure is the Don or boss, who dictates the activities of the family and has the final say on all decisions. He also acts as judge and jury of the family to settle all disputes and disagreements. Directly underneath the Don is the Capo Bastone, popularly known as the underboss. As expected, the underboss is the second in command in the Mafia family. He communicates directly with the boss and sometimes wades in to settle disputes. In addition, the underboss is sometimes groomed as a potential replacement for a Don in case of sickness or arrest. Below the underboss, you've got the capos. Each capo would lead a smaller group within the family, but critically, their objectives and activities must align with the interest of the boss and the underboss. Capos run different racketeering schemes, and they're entitled to some of the profits they generate before remitting the larger portion of the profits to the boss through the underboss. At the bottom of the ladder are soldiers. These are more or less like the errand boys of the Mafia family. They do the dirty job and clean up the criminal mess of the Don, the underboss, and the capos. Outside the standard hierarchical structure, the Mafia family also recognizes the existence of other positions like associates and consigliere. Despite not being part of the main structure, associates play a significant role in the day-to-day running of the Mafia. An associate of the Mafia family can be just about anyone, from petty thieves to informants, and even the so-called reputable members of society like lawyers, bankers, law enforcement enforcement agents, and, of course, politicians. A consigliere, on the other hand, acts as an advisor to the Mafia family and is sometimes called in to mediate between members of the crime group regardless of their rank. So, for instance, if a Don has issues with his underboss, a consigliere is invited to mediate between them. Consiglieres are often elected by members of a Mafia family, but sometimes they're appointed by the boss. In the early days of its existence, the Organized Crime Federation in Italy consisted of 5 major groups, including the Camorra Mafia, the 'Ndrangheta Mafia, the Sacra Corona Unita, the La Cosa Nostra, and the Sicilian Mafia. Ironically, when the business extended into the United States, much of its operations were facilitated by the 5 main Italian-American Mafia families. They include the Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo, and the Genovese families. As the founder of the Lucchese Mafia family, Gaetano Reina governed the affairs of the group. The small-statured crime boss Carlo Gambino was the leader of the Gambino family and the face of organized crime in New York City in the 1900s. Michael Mancuso ruled the Bonanno family. Joseph Anthony Colombo Sr. was the boss of the Colombo family, while Joe Masseria, otherwise known as Joe the Boss, headed the Genovese crime family. Generally, membership of the Mafia isn't open to everybody. To become a member of the Mafia, you must at least be half Italian and be sponsored by another made man. However, to become a bona fide member of some families, both parents of the potential gangster must be Italians. In the early 1960s, former gang member Joe Valachi revealed the induction process of the Mafia. According to Valachi's confession, in the hours leading to the induction, potential gangsters are ordered to dress up and taken to a secret location and given a special seat directly beside the boss of the family.
Edge of the table was a long table, and there was a gun and a knife on the table. And
how many were at the table?
About 35 to 40. And sat me down and made me repeat it.
Once the meeting is underway, other members of the Mafia in attendance will hold hands and oaths and loyalty anthems. Then the new gangster is introduced to the Omerta rule, a code of honor that guides the activities of every member of the Mafia. According to this sacred rule, made men are obligated never to seek recourse through the legal system regardless of the circumstances. In addition, the Omerta code of honor and conduct stipulates that mafiosos must never aid the detection of criminal activities committed by another member of the Mafia, even if such acts were committed against them or their acquaintances. This meant that in cases of disputes and conflicts, the right to avenge was exclusively reserved for the victims and their families. After these rules have been spelt out to the inductee in clear terms, he is required to swear his loyalty to the Mafia family. Next, the newbie will have his trigger thumb pricked with a sharp object by his godfather, and a few drops of blood are spilled on a paper. In some cases, this paper is set on fire and passed around among members of the Mafia until it gets to the new member, who is required to hold up the paper while it burns. Life as a recruit. Interestingly, getting past the induction stage does not necessarily mean that a potential mobster would become a bona fide member of the family. On the contrary, the challenges of the induction ceremony are just some of the many hurdles that newbies are expected to scale before they're admitted into the Mafia family. In the early stages, new mobsters are eased slowly into the life of criminality that they have chosen. For instance, in some families, a potential mobster would be paired with an experienced soldier who will act as his godfather and guide him through the hurdles in the early stages. But ultimately, the success or failure of a new recruit would depend on his resolve and dedication to the course. More often than not, recruits are assigned relatively easy tasks, like driving higher-ranked members of the family around or serving as bodyguards to their relatives. This was the case for Michael Franzese, a former member of the Colombo crime family. As the son of John Sonny Franzese, the underboss of the Colombo Mafia, Michael had a seamless entry into the family, but he still had to prove his worth. His first assignment was to serve as the personal driver of Thomas DeBella, the acting Columbia family boss at the time, and another member of the family named Andrew Russo. In a detailed media session many years later, Michael Franzese revealed how both men related with him and what it was like to drive them around.
Andrew, who took a liking to me and who I loved, and Tom, they were together all the time. I would drive them around. They liked me to drive.
You could tell that Michael clearly enjoyed his early days as a new recruit. But unfortunately, not all recruits get this type of soft landing. Some recruits are assigned difficult tasks. As a matter of fact, some of them are thrown straight into the action even before they settle into their new life as members of the Mafia. This is the reality in Italy, where established crime organizations recruit members of baby criminal gangs, popularly known as paranze. Members of these baby gangs are usually between the ages of 12 12 and 15, when they're recruited by the Camorra family on the streets of Naples and sometimes from social media. But not minding their tender age, the Mafia families would test them with dangerous tasks that ordinary teenagers and even adults wouldn't dare to undertake in their lifetime. Failure to execute these tasks successfully could result in serious consequences, including death. In a recent documentary, a member of the Camorra Mafia revealed how the family recruits young children in Naples. "We test them. We ask them to kill someone. If they do it, great. If not, we kill them instead." Interestingly, these kids are usually unfazed by the mental and physical demands of these tasks, and sometimes even complete them without flinching. Speaking to Italian journalist Alicia Camerano, one of the recruited kids highlights how they get the motivation to take on these gruesome tasks. "We have experienced everything," he explained. "We've seen hunger, death, drugs. We've grown up in suffering. Now our blood is cold. That's the thing. We aren't afraid of anything, not even death." For these kids and any other newbie looking to join the Mafia, it is important that they put up their best performance every time they're called upon, regardless of their background and the reputation of their godfather, because that's the only way to survive in the criminal world.
Anything that I was told to do to prove myself worthy, I did. That's what you have to do as a recruit. You have to prove yourself. Whether you are Sonny Franzise's son, Joe Colombo's son, Carlo Gambino's son, Paul Castellano's relative, Carmine Persico's son, it doesn't matter. You still have to prove yourself.
Beyond loyalty and the hardened heart to execute crazy tasks, new members must be at the beckon of the Mafia family at all times. As a new recruit, you are expected to show up and execute whatever tasks they're assigned, regardless of whatever is happening in their personal lives.
Well, here's the deal. From now on, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you're on call to serve this family, the Colombo family. That means if your mother is sick and she's dying and you're at her bedside, this family calls you to service, leave your mother, come and serve us. From now on, we're number one in your life before anything and everything.
Another quality that Mafia families demand from new recruits is absolute obedience. As explained by Michael Franzese, new members of the organized crime family are expected to obey their superiors at all times and also be good listeners.
So whatever I was told to do at that time, I did.
Based on tradition, new recruits aren't allowed to sit at the table when top secrets are discussed, so they don't exactly have accurate information about the day-to-day running of the Mafia. However, from listening to the conversations of their superiors,
now a lot of times I wasn't allowed to sit at the table, but I was there and I listened. I heard the discussions afterwards as much as they would allow me to hear because I wasn't a made guy yet. But I started to observe and I became a student of the life on-job training.
they can understand the current state of the family and the type of missions they'll be expected to execute. Despite the high level of professionalism that's required from them, new recruits are not always adequately rewarded. In fact, being a new kid on the block doesn't necessarily mean that you'd be handed generous tips by the Mafia. And that's why some new members of the Mafia sometimes engage in other legitimate and illegitimate businesses in a bid to increase their income, becoming a maid guy. Unfortunately, not every new recruit will get called up to officially join the Mafia as a maid guy, but at the right time, the few members that are able to scale through the probationary phase are officially welcomed to the crime family as made men. This new position comes with more financial benefits and, of course, more responsibilities. But that's not to say that all made men are well remunerated. Of course, you're going to get some basic and consistent financial benefits. However, it's definitely never going to be enough to make you wealthy, especially if you're just making your way in. And in most cases, the made men are even expected to remit money to the higher-ranked members of the Mafia. Critically, there are several paths to achieving success in the organized crime world, and as a made guy, you're expected to find your path and focus on the aspect of the business that you're good at. For instance, some made guys are better off as racketeers or earners, while others thrive more as gangsters. However, there are a few shining examples of men who thrived at both racketeering and gangsterism. Frank Costello is perhaps the best example of such men. Regarded as the real godfather and the prime minister of the underworld, Frank led the Luciano crime family, but his journey to the top of the tree was quite interesting. Between 1908 and 1918, Frank was arrested 3 times for assault and armed robbery, and as a result, he was sentenced to 10 months in prison. But once he got out, he made a decision to shun all acts of violence. This meant that the Mafia boss would never carry a gun again. Frank's decision to choose brain over brawn was quite strange for a mobster of his caliber, but in the end, it brought him tremendous success. Over the next couple of decades, he became very influential in the organized crime world, and even in real life. At the peak of his career as a mobster, Costello testified before the U.S. Senate Organized Organized Crime Investigating Committee and attended the 1932 Democratic National Convention held in Chicago. As a matter of fact, reports suggest that he was one of the people who helped Franklin D. Roosevelt secure the presidential nomination at the convention. That was how powerful and influential he was at the time. And for the rest of his lifetime, Frank Costello remained heavily involved in different acts of criminality. He was arrested multiple times and survived several assassination attempts. But remarkably, he died a free man on the 18th of February 1973. Of course, not every made man would be able to live the type of life Costello lived. However, his journey through the ranks of the Mafia family and his achievements in real life gives us an insight into the lifestyle of a typical made man. You see, as a made man, you're not really made until you have the political connection and social influence to cover up your illicit business and, more importantly, keep you out of jail. This might sound cliche, but history has shown that only a few mobsters have been able to successfully master the act of building a strong social and political influence while building their illegal crime empire. Again, the ability of a mobster to build such connections and influence depends on how much money you make and the amount of bribes you're willing to dole out. As a freshman in the Mafia family, you'd most likely start by paying out small bribes to compromise the authorities in your locality. However, as you scale up the family tree, you'd begin to negotiate and give out staggering bribes to influential members of society, like councilors, commissioners, governors, and even presidents. But regardless of whatever lofty achievements you may have had as a made guy, you must, at all times, remain answerable to your Capo regime. The relationship between a made guy and his Capo regime could differ depending on the Mafia family and the task to be executed. But as standard practice, a made man is expected to always inform his Capo regime about his movements and activities. This might sound like a routine task, but it's actually one of the most important rules that every made man must obey. As a former made man himself, Michael Franzese definitely knows how important it is for a made man to have a robust relationship with his Capo regime.
Oh, but Andrew Russo was my Capo regime, and yes, I had to visit him 2, 3, 4 times a week. Anything that I was doing on the street, I had to put on record. Even if it was legitimate,
In the criminal underworld, failure to communicate properly or lying to a superior member can lead to dire consequences, as it did for Juancho Guzman many years ago. Juancho was the cousin of famous Mexican kingpin El Chapo. Like other members of the Sinaloa cartel, Juancho faithfully served the diminutive drug lord, but a simple lie about his whereabouts cost him his place in the cartel and, ultimately, his life. According to the court testimony of Damaso Lopez Nunez, a former cartel member, Juancho had told El Chapo that he was out of town. However, other cartel members found him strolling in a public park in Culiacan and immediately informed the drug lord about it. Recalling this shocking event, Nunez told the jurors that El Chapo's fury was ignited when he learned that his cousin had lied to him. And, despite the fact that they were blood-related, El Chapo was eager to make an example of Juancho, perhaps to deter other cartel members from lying to him. So the drug kingpin gave his henchmen matching orders to assassinate Juancho. This scenario highlights the high level of honesty and accountability that Capo regimes demand from their soldiers, especially because in the organized crime world, mistakes can be very costly. As a made guy, running errands and attending meetings with the Capo regime is a significant part of your description, and as we've seen with Juancho and El Chapo, made guys are expected to always show up when called upon. With time, every made man is expected to get better at the craft and, at some point, begin to assemble a gang of his own, even while still serving under his Capo regime. This would allow them to test their leadership skills and, more importantly, ease their transition from being a made guy to becoming a Capo regime. Life as a Capo regime. The step up from being a made man to becoming a Capo regime in the Mafia can be quite tedious, especially with the bustling lifestyle and the tons of responsibilities that come with it. One of the most significant upgrades that come with being a Capo regime is that you have to lead a large crew of at least 10 soldiers and several associates. They'll relate and report directly to you on all activities, and in return, you'll assign tasks to them and supervise their work from start to finish. As the gang leader, you are also expected to provide guidance when needed. Life as a Capo regime means having a lot of meetings not only with your soldiers, but also with the underboss and boss of your Mafia family. In other words, Capos are required to act as a middleman between the foot soldiers and the higher-ranked members of the organized crime world. So, when something happens on the field, the soldiers cannot go straight to the underboss or the boss to report the situation. They must follow the appropriate chain of command by reporting to the Capo regime, who would then pass on the message to the rulers of the Mafia family. But except when stated otherwise by the boss or the underboss, underboss. The Capo regime is at liberty to take decisions based on his discretion as long as it is in the interest of the family. As a result, a Capo regime is responsible for everything that happens within the jurisdiction he oversees. This includes absolute control over all business activities and the well-being of the made men under him. Speaking about business, the position of Capo regime is one of the most rewarding positions in the Mafia family. That's because a Capo is entitled to a percentage of the proceeds of business, and depending on the size of the family and the turnover from a particular region, a Capo in the Mafia can earn up to several millions of dollars. This was the case for Michael Franzese, a former Capo regime in the Colombo crime family. At the height of his career in the criminal underworld, Michael's Mafia family made between $8 and $10 million. As a result, he enjoyed quite a lot of luxuries and became one of the biggest assets to the crime family. Speaking in a recent interview, Michael revealed some of the luxuries he enjoyed as a Capo regime. "I had a lot going on. I had a jet, plane, a helicopter. I had houses all over the country," the former mobster said. "So I mean, we were doing very well. My whole crew was doing well." At some point, multiple reports claimed that Michael Franzese was the highest-earning mobster since the legendary Al Capone. While these luxuries signify his hard work and success of a Capo regime, they also come with several challenges. For instance, controlling a multi-million-dollar mafia enterprise requires a lot of time, and this means that the Capos often spend most of their time away from their family. Reminiscing his hectic schedule during his time as a Capo regime, Michael Franzese said,
"That I had family life that I admit I wasn't great at. Yeah, I love my kids, and yeah, I love my family, but I wasn't great at it. I tried to dedicate a lot of time, but I was, so into, the mob life at that time and business at that time. I have regrets on how I handled it back then."
On top of that, if a Capo regime becomes extremely powerful and influential, he's sometimes seen as a threat to the higher-ranked members of the Mafia. In this case, a structural change or general reorganization is most likely enforced to ensure that the position of the boss and underboss are protected. Lastly, the success of a Capo regime is always bound to attract the attention of law enforcement agencies. We've seen it all through history, from guys like Al Capone to El Chapo, and even Michael Franzese.
And of course, I started getting in trouble. Indictments left and right. I was indicted 7 times. I had 2 federal racketeering cases. I had 2 state racketeering cases. I was fighting cases. I was with my lawyers. It was a lot of work, people, I can tell you that. So trying to balance
dealing with the feds. For most successful mafias, having constant run-ins with the feds is almost inevitable. As a matter of fact, every prominent mobster in history was on the watch list of the feds at some point in their life. The first major swoop on mob activities in the United States happened in 1957, when a team of security operatives, including New York State troopers and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, tracked a fleet of luxury cars to a street in Appalachian. Interestingly, these out-of-license vehicles parked conspicuously close to the house of Joseph Barbara, popularly known as Joe the Barber. Barbara was an Italian-American mobster who just happened to have been charged for multiple crimes, including murder. Initially, the intent of Barbara's strange visitors wasn't exactly clear, but the authorities were convinced that something was fishy. After some extensive surveillance operations, Sergeant Edgar Croswell discovered that Barbara's guests were actually in town to attend an event called the Appalachian Meeting at a nearby hotel. Stunned by the magnitude of his discovery, Sergeant Edgar Croswell called for support, and when more officers arrived, they bursted this secret meeting and arrested 58 people. A couple others managed to escape, but as Michael Newton would later recall in his book Mafia at Appalachian, this meeting changed the course of history. Before then, the authorities have had to battle against a group of professional criminals that wreaked havoc on the American economy during the Prohibition era. At the time, about 1,300 criminal gangs reportedly operated in Chicago, engaging in activities such as racketeering, bootlegging, drug trafficking, auto theft, and bank robbery. As of 1926, the FBI estimated that the activities of different mafia families led to the death of over 12,000 people every year. However, there was some level of reluctance among the authorities to officially recognize the mafia families. And interestingly, Al Capone, who at the time was the face of the organized crime industry in the United States, seemed invincible. No matter how hard the feds tried, they just couldn't pin a federal crime on him. But eventually, the notorious mobster ran out of luck as he testified before a grand jury on the 20th of March 1929. For the next 7 days, Al Capone appeared in the court to testify in front of the same jury, and the gangster would have been hoping to walk away on the last day of process as a free man. But as soon as he made his way out the court on March 27, 1929, he was arrested for contempt of court. But just before the authorities could celebrate the arrest of Al Capone, John Gotti emerged as a worthy replacement. The notorious mobster was first arrested in 1968 for attempting to steal expensive merchandise. He got a lenient sentence and was released in 1972, exactly 2 years after the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was passed. This act was enacted to strengthen the legal system and curb the illicit activities of the mafia families. But it didn't exactly have the kind of impact that the authorities thought it would have. Through illegal schemes like bribery and corruption, guys like John Gotti were able to circumvent the law and stay in and out of prison. But over time, the feds invented new methods of combating them. This included the use of wiretaps, informants, and even undercover agents to gather information about criminal organizations and their members. These methods were particularly helpful when the DEA took down the Guadalajara cartel in the 1980s. A special DEA agent named Kiki Camarena successfully infiltrated the cartel, and from the information he gathered, security operatives were able to crack down on the activities of the gang. By the time the cartel boss Felix Gallardo realized what was going on, the group had already suffered heavy losses. In a bid to get revenge, Felix Gallardo ordered his men to kidnap and murder the Kiki Camarena in cold blood. This incident sparked outrage among the Mexican and U.S. governments as law enforcement agencies from both countries collaborated to arrest Felix Gallardo and take down the Guadalajara cartel for good. But then again, you had men like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who for many years seemed invincible and untouchable. In fact, despite all of the special methods deployed by the authorities, El Chapo twice escaped maximum prison in Mexico. And had he not been extradited to the United States, he probably would have done it again for an unprecedented third time. Allegedly, his prison break stunts and other audacious moves were made possible by the high level of corruption in the Mexican public sector. And to be honest, they will go down as some of the most daring acts ever performed by the mobster. However, when it comes to handling the feds and staying out of prison, no gangster in history comes close to the legendary Frank Costello. Despite being heavily involved in crime and getting arrested multiple times in the early stages of his life, Costello got his act together, and he was able to stay away from prison for many decades until he died. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please click on any of the cards on your screen to watch more exciting videos like this one.